Last night's encounter wasn't just skin against skin. It was an exchange of energy that's now woven into your psychological fabric. You can feel it lingering, that subtle shift in your mind that wasn't there before. That's not overthinking. That's your biology speaking truths society tries to silence. Your brain, a 3-pound universe of electrical connections, treats intimacy like a chemical warfare campaign. Dopamine floods neural pathways. Oxytocin creates invisible bonds. Serotonin rewires your emotional landscape. This biochemical hurricane doesn't check whether you've labeled the encounter casual before unleashing its power. It simply executes programming that's been perfected over hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. Modern hookup culture sells a compelling fantasy, physical pleasure without psychological consequence, convenient, comfortable, completely disconnected from reality. It's like jumping off a cliff and expecting gravity to make an exception for you, because you've decided falling isn't part of your plan. The laws of human psychology don't bend to social trends any more than physics bends to wishful thinking. The emotional detachment narrative is perhaps the most successful marketing campaign ever run against your psychological well-being. It promises freedom while delivering fragmentation. It advertises liberation while creating subtle chains. Your mind doesn't organize experiences into meaningful and casual folders. It absorbs every intimate encounter as a significant event, regardless of the story you tell yourself afterward. Each encounter leaves its mark. Those marks accumulate, microscopic fractures in your capacity for connection that over time transform into fault lines. You won't notice the damage immediately. That's what makes it dangerous. You'll feel it later, in the strange emptiness that visits during quiet moments, in the growing difficulty connecting deeply with someone, in relationships that somehow never quite reach the depths you once thought possible. The truth about intimacy isn't comfortable, but understanding it will set you free in ways casual encounters never will. Section 1. The Neuropsychology of Connection. Your intimate encounters create psychological imprints far deeper than most realize. Dr. Helen Fisher's groundbreaking research at Rutgers University revealed that what we experience as chemistry is actually an intricate psychological attachment process. During moments of deep connection, your mind forms cognitive maps of the other person, not just their physical attributes, but how they make you feel, the emotional landscape you enter with them. These maps become reference points for future connections, often unconsciously guiding you towards similar patterns. When you dismiss an encounter as meaningless, you're ignoring this powerful psychological mapping process that continues regardless of your conscious framing. The psychological concept of state-dependent learning explains why intimate moments create such powerful memory imprints. Experiences encoded during heightened emotional states become reference points for how we understand similar situations in the future. Intimate encounters create somatic markers, psychological associations between certain emotions, sensations, and interpersonal dynamics. These markers become unconscious guides, leading you to recreate familiar patterns even when they cause pain. The more these patterns repeat, the more deeply encoded they become in your psychological framework. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung identified soul fragments that form during moments of deep connection. According to Jung, parts of our psychological energy become invested in others during intimate encounters. When these connections end abruptly or lack conscious integration, we experience soul loss, a subtle sense that pieces of ourselves are scattered across our relationship history. This fragmentation often manifests as commitment issues, emotional numbness, or the inability to form deep connections. This isn't poetic metaphor, but psychological reality. Your mind forms attachments that require integration, not dismissal. The unpredictable nature of casual relationships creates intermittent reinforcement patterns, the most psychologically binding form of connection. The uncertainty about when you'll next connect, where you stand, or whether the other person truly values you, activates the same psychological mechanisms that drive addiction. Repeated experiences of connection followed by disconnection without proper processing create attachment wounds that deepen with each occurrence. You might notice this in your own experience, feeling more intensely drawn to people who are inconsistent or emotionally unavailable, despite logically wanting stability. Intimate moments create psychological expectations, even without verbal commitments. Your psyche naturally forms implicit contracts during vulnerable exchanges. When these unspoken expectations are violated by emotional disconnection afterward, your mind experiences micro-traumas. These small wounds rarely register as traumatic individually, but collectively reshape your capacity for trust and vulnerability. You may notice this as a gradual hardening, a subtle hesitation to open up fully, or an increasing tendency to preemptively disconnect before others can. Even brief encounters activate your attachment system, the psychological framework that governs how you connect with others. This system doesn't distinguish between casual and committed encounters. It responds to the vulnerability, pleasure, and emotional resonance of the experience itself. Each activation of this system creates expectations, and each disconnection forces your psyche to adapt. Over time, these adaptations become your relationship identity, the unconscious template that guides how you approach connection. As these psychological imprints accumulate over time, they create patterns that eventually crystallize into who you become in relationships. Which brings us to how these repeated experiences fundamentally transform your capacity for connection. Section 2. The accumulating impact. Your attachment system wasn't designed for repeated connection and disconnection. It evolved for sustained bonds, for the deep knowing of another human being over time. When you repeatedly engage in detached encounters, you're essentially training your attachment system to expect disconnection. Psychologist John Bowlby documented how this works. Your mind begins to create defensive adaptations to protect itself from the pain of repeated separation. Initially, these defenses are subtle: a slight hesitation to get too emotionally involved, mild anxiety after intimate encounters, small shifts in how open you allow yourself to be. But over time, these adaptations become more rigid. Your brain begins to associate intimacy itself with eventual abandonment. This correlation isn't conscious. It forms in the deeper layers of your psychological framework, influencing your feelings and behaviors in ways you can't readily identify. The fragmentation of your emotional landscape doesn't happen all at once. It occurs in small, nearly imperceptible pieces. Picture a mosaic slowly losing tiles. At first, the image remains recognizable, but eventually crucial pieces go missing, and the picture becomes distorted. After repeated detached encounters, you might notice strange emotional responses that seem disconnected from your conscious intentions. Unexpected sadness after physical intimacy, inexplicable irritability, or emotional withdrawal that happens automatically. Jung called this emotional fragmentation splinter psyches, parts of yourself that break off and operate independently. These fragments create internal contradictions, wanting connection yet pushing it away, craving intimacy yet feeling relief when it ends. The most troubling aspect is how these fragments operate outside your awareness, creating behaviors that seem mysterious even to you. Progressive emotional numbness develops not as a choice, but as a psychological necessity. As detached encounters accumulate, fully experiencing the subtle grief of each disconnection becomes too painful. Your mind adapts by dulling the emotional response system, first to disappointment, then to attachment feelings themselves. This numbing process follows a predictable trajectory that psychologist Robert Firestone mapped. Initial sensitivity gives way to mild detachment, which evolves into difficulty feeling deep connection, eventually culminating in a state where even when you want to feel deeply, the capacity seems diminished. This isn't character weakness. It's your mind's attempt to protect you from repeated pain. The tragedy lies in how this protective mechanism eventually prevents the very connection you might ultimately seek. Long-term capability for relationship formation doesn't remain unaffected by your intimate history. Attachment theorist Mary Ainsworth discovered that our capacity to form secure attachments isn't fixed. It changes based on relationship experiences. Repeated patterns of connection followed by disconnection reshape your expectations, your emotional responses, and ultimately your behavior in future relationships. This materializes in subtle but significant ways: increased vigilance for signs of rejection, difficulty trusting positive signals, hesitation to fully engage emotionally, or paradoxically, rushing attachment to preempt abandonment. When genuine connection opportunity arrives, these adaptations don't simply disappear. They actively interfere with the formation of secure bonds. The protective mechanisms that helped you survive casual disconnection become the very barriers that prevent the deeper connection you might eventually seek. But understanding how these patterns form is only half the journey. Section 3. The path to authentic intimacy. Look at your patterns with ruthless honesty. Those recurring relationship dynamics aren't coincidences. They're your attachment system speaking in the only language it knows. Start by tracking emotional reactions that seem disproportionate. The intense anxiety when someone doesn't text back. The relief when plans fall through. The inexplicable emptiness after physical intimacy. These responses are breadcrumbs leading to your unique attachment patterns. Carl Jung emphasized that healing begins with making the unconscious conscious, bringing awareness to automatic responses before trying to change them. Your attachment style wasn't formed overnight, and a single realization won't transform it. But awareness creates a crucial gap between trigger and response. In that gap lives your freedom to choose differently. Notice how you pursue unavailable people or sabotage connections as they deepen. These aren't character flaws, but adaptive strategies that once protected you. By recognizing them without judgment, you begin the integration process. Your psychological boundaries need reconstruction from the ground up. Most people think boundaries are about keeping others out, but their deeper purpose is keeping you intact. After repeated casual connections, boundaries often exist in extremes, either rigid walls that prevent genuine intimacy, or porous membranes that leave you vulnerable to emotional invasion. Healthy boundaries are selectively permeable. They allow authentic connection while maintaining your psychological integrity. Rebuilding starts with physical boundaries, the simplest to identify and enforce. Who has access to your body, under what conditions, and with what level of commitment? These aren't moralistic questions, but psychological ones. Physical intimacy creates psychological vulnerability by design. Honoring this reality means ensuring the conditions for physical connection support, rather than undermine your emotional well-being. From there, rebuild emotional boundaries, recognizing which parts of yourself to share based on established trust, rather than momentary desire for connection. Intentionality transforms intimate encounters from unconscious reenactments to conscious choices. Most casual connections happen through default, following impulses, cultural scripts, or relationship inertia without clear intention. Breaking this pattern requires developing what psychologist Esther Perel calls erotic intelligence, the capacity to bring consciousness to desire. Before engaging intimately, ask yourself, what am I truly seeking here? What meaning does this connection hold? What am I prepared to give and receive emotionally? These aren't questions of permission but clarity. When intention guides intimate choices, even brief encounters can support integration rather than fragmentation. The key distinction isn't between casual and committed relationships, but between unconscious and conscious connections. Intentionality doesn't eliminate risk or guarantee specific outcomes, but it ensures your choices align with your authentic needs, rather than compensating for unconscious wounds. The practical path toward integration follows a counterintuitive trajectory, often requiring temporary abstinence from the very connections you're drawn to. This creates space to develop what attachment theorist John Bowlby called earned security, the capacity for secure attachment developed through conscious work rather than fortunate early experiences. Begin by journaling about past encounters without minimizing their impact. Identify patterns in who you're drawn to and how connections typically unfold. Work with a therapist trained in attachment theory to understand how your specific history shapes current behaviors. Practice emotional regulation skills that help you stay present during triggering situations. Gradually expand your capacity for authentic vulnerability in friendships before romantic connections. When you do engage romantically, progress at a pace that allows for integration between encounters. This isn't about restriction, but integration, ensuring each experience becomes part of your coherent narrative rather than another fragmented memory. What if the depth you're truly seeking isn't found in the arms of another person, but in the courage to finally face yourself completely?